It was the summer of 2016, and I had taken a solo trip through parts of Europe. I was 25 at the time, and after weeks of city hopping, I wanted something quieter, away from train stations, hostels, and crowds. I had planned a couple of days in Austria before heading further south. I found a small campsite online, tucked in the lower slopes of the Salzkammergut Mountains, about an hour's bus ride from Salzburg. The pictures showed a calm lake, dense pine forests, and flat areas where tents could be pitched. It looked perfect. The day I arrived was warm and clear. The small bus left me at a gravel pull-off with a wooden sign pointing toward the campsite. The path wound through tall grass, which swayed gently in the breeze, and the air smelled faintly of sap from the evergreens nearby. There was no reception building, just a faded board with a map of the area and a small payment box with instructions in German and English. The place seemed quiet. I spotted only 2 other tents off in the distance, barely visible through the trees. I picked a spot about 50 meters from the edge of the forest, close enough to the lake to hear water lapping against the shore, but far enough away to feel sheltered. The ground was soft with pine needles, and when I knelt to drive the stakes in, my hands came away smelling faintly of resin. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring, following narrow trails that wound into the forest. The air inside the trees was cooler, almost damp, and every now and then I heard the distant sound of cowbells from the hills beyond. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. The lake turned a deep shade of blue, and the air carried a sharper chill. I made a small dinner from the supplies in my pack, then sat watching the water darken, listening to the quiet. There was almost no wind. I remember thinking how rare it felt, completely alone but without feeling uneasy. At least not yet. I turned in just after 10. The inside of my tent felt warm from the day's heat, and I fell asleep quickly. At some point in the night, though, I woke up. The air was colder, and there was a faint sound outside, something like soft, steady footsteps on pine needles. I stayed still, listening. The steps would come for a few seconds, then stop, then start again. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, deer maybe, but the rhythm was wrong, too even, too deliberate. Eventually, the sound faded, and I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the ground was wet from a light rain, and I noticed something strange near the edge of my tent. A single, partial footprint in the mud. It was bigger than mine, with the pattern of a heavy boot. I told myself it could have been left earlier, maybe by another camper passing through, though my stomach felt unsettled thinking about it. The day passed without incident. I took a long walk along the lake, climbed part of a trail up the slope, and returned to the campsite late in the afternoon. I didn't see anyone the whole time. Not the other campers, not anyone from the nearby village. As night came, the clouds thickened, and a light rain started again. The steady tapping on the tent made it harder to hear anything else outside, but I tried not to dwell on the noises from the night before. I must have been asleep for a few hours when I woke again, this time from something more distinct. It was the sound of wet leaves and needles being pressed underfoot, slow and heavy. Whoever or whatever it was, they were close. Then I saw it. A shadow moving against the faint light filtering through the tent fabric. Tall, broad shoulders. The shape passed slowly along one side of my tent, paused, then took a step back. My chest tightened so hard I barely breathed. I didn't move. I just stared at the fabric, watching as the shadow shifted again. The rain made it impossible to hear breathing or other noises, but the outline was clear enough that I knew it was a man. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds. Finally, the shadow moved away toward the forest. I lay there frozen, every sound magnified in my ears. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I unzipped the tent and scanned the clearing. The rain had eased, leaving the ground damp and soft. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the mud, deep and clear. They came from the tree line, circled my tent twice, and then led back into the woods. I considered packing up immediately, but I told myself it could still be some hiker passing through, maybe curious about my camp. I forced myself to stay, though I kept my knife closer that day and barely left my tent except to eat. That night, the rain stopped completely. The air was colder, and the quiet was sharp. Every small sound carried farther. I tried to sleep early, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow steps, deliberate, coming from the forest. I kept still, every muscle tense. The sound stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing this time, heavy, steady. The fabric shifted slightly, like a hand had brushed against it. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then came the part that still makes my skin crawl. There was the sound of someone crouching down, their weight shifting onto their heels, right beside my tent. They didn't say anything, didn't move, just crouched there, breathing, for what felt like minutes. My hand was clenched around the knife in my sleeping bag, my mind running through every possibility. If I yelled, if I ran, if I stayed silent. Finally, the sound of slow, heavy steps moved away into the forest. I waited, listening until I couldn't hear anything else, then slowly sat up. I didn't sleep again that night. At dawn, I packed everything as quickly as I could, barely stopping to eat. I followed the path back toward the road, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. When I reached the gravel pull-off, I saw something that made my stomach knot even more. On the far side of the clearing, leaning against one of the pines, was a man. Tall, wearing a dark coat, boots caked in mud. He wasn't looking at me directly, just standing there, head slightly tilted, like he was pretending to watch something in the trees. I didn't slow down. I kept walking until I reached the bus stop, my pack heavy and my hands damp with sweat despite the cool air. The bus came after 20 long minutes. When it pulled away, I glanced back through the window. The clearing was empty. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. Maybe it was nothing, some wanderer from the village, curious about a lone camper. But I know what I heard those nights, the deliberate way he moved, the quiet crouch beside my tent. That wasn't curiosity. It felt like he was waiting for something or deciding something. And whatever it was, I'm glad I left before he made up his mind. I was 29 that summer in 2017 when I decided to take my dog, Scout, out for a weekend of camping in northern Wyoming. Scout was a 4-year-old mixed breed, medium-sized, all muscle and energy. I had been working long hours in the city and wanted some quiet, just me, him, and open land. I'd chosen a stretch of national forest, far from the designated campgrounds. I wanted to avoid the weekend crowds, so I picked a spot about a mile off an unpaved logging road, near a slow-moving creek. The air was dry but heavy with the smell of pine. There were no marked trails where I went, only faint signs of old footpaths and deer runs. The place felt untouched. I set up my small green tent in a clearing about 50 feet from the water. The sun was lowering behind the ridgeline when I finished staking the last corner. Scout sniffed every inch of the campsite, tail high, then flopped down in the grass to watch me unpack my gear. By the time darkness came, the temperature dropped sharply. The forest around us went still except for the occasional sound of water trickling over rocks. I cooked a small meal over the camp stove, split some with Scout, and then sat listening to the night. Far off, maybe a quarter mile, I thought I heard something moving in the brush. Too slow to be a deer, too heavy to be a raccoon. Scout's ears twitched, but he didn't get up, so I let it go. When I finally crawled into the tent, Scout settled in beside me, his body warm against my sleeping bag. The smell of the nylon mixed with the damp earth underneath. I left the rainfly partly unzipped to let air in, watching the black silhouette of the trees sway against the dim starlight. My thoughts drifted, but something kept me from fully sleeping. Scout's breathing was steady, but his head kept lifting, then resting again. It must have been around midnight when he suddenly stiffened. His body went rigid, head up, ears forward. I couldn't hear anything at first, only my own heartbeat speeding up. Then I caught it. A faint crunch of footsteps on dry needles, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the creek. They weren't heavy like boots, but not as light as a small animal. The sound stopped, then started again, closer. I reached for my flashlight without unzipping the sleeping bag, trying to make no noise. Scout let out a low growl, barely more than a vibration in his chest. I switched on the light and aimed it through the tent mesh toward the sound. Nothing moved, just the pale trunks of trees and the darkness between them. But the footsteps had stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the quiet rush of water and my own breathing. Then I heard another noise, this time from the opposite side of camp. It was faint, like something brushing against a tree trunk. My stomach tightened. It felt like there were 2 points of movement, maybe more. I stayed still, listening, until my arms started to ache from holding the flashlight. Then I heard a new sound, metal tapping. Just one short click, like a rock hitting the side of a shovel. It was so out of place in the middle of the forest that my skin prickled instantly. Scout shifted, his claws digging slightly into the ground, his gaze fixed on the dark. I didn't want to make a noise, but I also didn't want to be blind. I unzipped the sleeping bag and slid out as quietly as I could. I grabbed the small hatchet I kept near the tent door. I crouched low, listening. Minutes passed, maybe more. The night seemed to stretch, pressing in. Then, from the direction of the logging road, I caught a flicker of light, weak, yellow, bobbing slowly. A flashlight. Whoever it was wasn't moving fast, and they weren't using it to search. It was pointed down like they didn't want to draw attention. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave, but moving through the forest in the dark with only a small flashlight would be just as risky. I decided to wait to see if they passed by. The light disappeared for a few minutes, then reappeared, this time lower, as if whoever held it had crouched or was behind something. I couldn't hear the creak anymore over the pounding in my ears. Scout's growl deepened, and I put my hand on his back to steady him. That's when I heard it again, the faint crunch of footsteps, now coming from behind us, between the tent and the road. Whoever it was, they weren't alone. I knew staying in the tent was the worst choice now. I quickly unclipped Scout's leash from my backpack, looped it onto his collar, and held the hatchet tight in my other hand. I stuffed the flashlight into my jacket pocket, using my hand to shield its beam so it didn't give away our position. We slipped into the trees, moving in the opposite direction of the lights. I kept low, choosing ground that was soft enough to muffle our steps. Scout stayed close, alert but silent. The forest was uneven here, with fallen logs and patches of thick brush. I navigated by memory and the sound of the creek until I was far enough to turn upstream. I could still hear faint movements behind us, spread out, like more than one person walking slowly, stopping often. They weren't calling out, weren't talking, just searching. It took over an hour to work our way back toward the logging road, moving wide around where I'd seen the light earlier. My truck was parked about a quarter mile down the road from the trail I'd taken in. The night air felt colder here, the trees less dense. I could see the pale strip of gravel through the trunks. That's when Scout froze again. Ahead, maybe 30 yards up the road, I saw another dim light, this one steady, not moving. It was parked low, near the ground, like someone sitting with a flashlight. My stomach dropped. My truck was in that direction. We waited, crouched in the brush. My mind kept counting options, none good. I could hear the faint hum of insects, the slow pulse of my own breath, and somewhere far back in the trees, another faint tap of metal. I decided to move deeper into the forest and put more distance between us and the road. I'd rather wait until morning than risk walking into whatever was ahead. By the time the eastern sky started to lighten, we were both exhausted. Scout was limping slightly from stepping on something sharp in the dark. I kept us moving until I recognized a slope I'd crossed on the way in. From there, I cut back to the road from a different angle, emerging about 100 yards behind my truck. I stayed in the trees, scanning for movement. The road was empty, no lights, no figures. I jogged the last stretch, unlocked the truck, and got Scout inside. My hands shook as I turned the key and drove, gravel spitting under the tires. Only when I hit the main paved road did I let myself slow down. I glanced in the rearview mirror, just empty road and forest. But the image of those slow, deliberate lights moving through the trees stayed with me the whole drive home. I never figured out who they were or what they were doing that night. There was no reason for anyone to be that deep in the forest, moving without speaking, circling a campsite. The thought of how close they'd been, how they'd split up to surround the area, made my skin crawl for weeks afterward. Scout slept in the back seat the whole way, his head on his paws, but every time I shifted, his ears twitched like he was still listening for those same footsteps. I haven't camped that far off trail since, and I've never gone out there alone again. It was late summer of 1998, and I had taken a week off from my job in Ohio to drive out west and camp in the mountains of Wyoming. I was 29 then, still young enough to feel invincible, but old enough to crave quiet over nightlife. I wanted to be away from people, far from phones, noise, and the endless hum of the city. I had planned the trip carefully. Maps spread on my kitchen table for days, marking a small, remote section of the Bighorn National Forest where there were no official campgrounds, just miles of pine, creeks, and unpaved forest roads. I left my truck parked on a rough dirt pull-off and hiked about 3 miles in with my pack and gear. The air smelled sharp with pine and dust. The trail, if you could call it that, was faint, just a narrow line of flattened grass and dirt through knee-high brush. I found a flat spot near a small creek that had just enough room for my tent and a fire pit. No signs of other campers. No beer cans, no burnt logs, just clean ground. I pitched the tent and spent the late afternoon gathering dry wood. The silence felt heavier than I expected. Even in the deep woods back home, you still heard the distant sound of a car or a plane overhead every so often. Here, there was nothing except the faint trickle of the creek and the occasional creak of trees in the breeze. By the time the sun dipped low, the temperature was already dropping. I had my fire going, cooking a small pan of beans, the smell drifting into the night air. I ate slow, staring into the flames. The darkness beyond the firelight was total. The stars above were so thick they looked like spilled salt. That first night passed quietly. I woke once to the sound of something moving through the brush near the creek, but the footfalls were light and slow, probably a deer. The second day, I hiked further upriver, following the creek through dense pines and over patches of smooth granite. Around midday, I found an old, collapsed log cabin. It was just 4 walls left standing, the roof long gone. Moss clung to the wood, and rusted tin lay half buried in the grass. Inside, there was a broken chair, the legs splintered and gray with rot. I stayed only a few minutes. It felt strange being there, like I was stepping into something I wasn't supposed to see. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was already leaning low. I started the fire earlier than the night before. The quiet was deeper now. No birds calling, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just stillness. I ate, read a few pages from the paperback I'd brought, and turned in early. It was maybe 2 hours later when I woke up. My tent was cold. my sleeping bag pulled tight around my shoulders. At first, I thought it was the wind that had woken me, but then I realized there was no wind. The night was still. Then I heard it, footsteps. Not the slow, irregular steps of a deer or elk. These were steady. 2 legs. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. They were coming from the direction of the creek, moving closer. My heart picked up. I stayed still, breathing slow, my ears straining. The steps came to a stop just outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away. There was no light, just darkness pressing against the thin nylon. I couldn't see anything. I thought about calling out, but something in me said not to. The footsteps started again, moving slowly around the tent. I could hear the grass brushing against whatever it was. Once it stopped right at the backside, just inches from where my head was. I held my breath. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. Then, without warning, the steps moved away, deliberate, fading back toward the creek until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep much after that. Every small sound outside made me tense. The next morning, the ground around my tent looked different. The grass was pressed down in a clear arc, like someone had walked around it during the night. I crouched low, scanning for shoe prints. There were faint impressions, too large to be from me, too wide apart for a deer. I spent most of the day debating whether to pack up and leave. It would take hours to hike out and then drive back to the nearest town. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe scouting. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my gear ready to pack in a hurry. That evening, I built my fire higher, the flames leaping against the dark. I didn't wander far from camp. Every shadow felt closer than it should. I sat with my back against a log, my flashlight beside me, listening. It was just past midnight when I heard the sound again. This time it didn't come from the creek. It came from uphill through the trees. Slow steps, a pause, another step. I could hear twigs snapping under the weight. The sound circled wider this time, staying just beyond the reach of my firelight. I kept the flashlight aimed toward the sound, but I couldn't catch a shape, just black trees shifting in the dark. Then the steps stopped. The forest went dead quiet. I sat there for nearly an hour, every muscle tight, waiting, but nothing came closer. When morning broke, I made my decision. I packed everything in less than 20 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't even stop to refill my water. The hike back felt longer than it should have. My ears tuned to every noise behind me. Several times I thought I heard faint footsteps on the trail behind me, but when I stopped, there was only the whisper of pine needles in the breeze. When I finally reached the truck, I loaded my gear fast, my hands shaking. I didn't look back as I drove down that narrow dirt road. By the time I hit the main highway, the sun was high, and the open sky made me feel a little less on edge. But even now, years later, I still think about those nights out there, about how whoever or whatever was walking around my camp wasn't just passing by. They were watching, moving slow, making sure I knew they were there. I never went back to that part of Wyoming, and I never camp alone that far from people anymore. The rain had been falling since before sunset, a steady drumming on the tarp above my tent that had grown heavier as the night went on. I was deep in the Amazon, far from any town, camping on a patch of muddy ground I had cleared earlier that day. The air was heavy and damp, thick with the smell of wet soil, rotting leaves, and the faint tang of smoke from the small fire I had built before the rain killed it. I was 32 at the time, traveling alone, moving downriver by canoe and setting up camp each night wherever I could find a flat space. It was 2018, late in the wet season, and every day the river swelled higher. The rain made the jungle sound alive in a strange, overwhelming way. It didn't just fall. It crashed through leaves, ran in streams down tree trunks, and splashed in the puddles forming all around me. Beneath that constant noise, I could still hear the insects, a high, buzzing chorus that never stopped, and somewhere in the distance, the low, throaty croak of frogs. My tent felt like a thin bubble in the middle of something massive and restless. I had eaten a cold meal earlier, a few mouthfuls of rice and beans from a tin, and I was lying on my sleeping mat trying to ignore the wet chill that had crept into my clothes. My shirt clung to me, and the humidity made it impossible for anything to dry. Every time I shifted, my elbow brushed the damp nylon of the tent wall and left a wet mark on my skin. My boots, sitting just outside the tent flap, were probably filling with rainwater by now. I'd have to dump them out in the morning. I wasn't exactly afraid yet, just uncomfortable, restless, and aware of how far I was from help if anything went wrong. I had been alone in the jungle before, but there's something about a night like that, black sky, constant rain, no moonlight, that makes you feel more isolated than usual. The forest felt endless. It was sometime past midnight when I heard it, different from the rain, different from the frogs, different from the night. A soft, irregular rustling from somewhere beyond the tent. Not the wind. The rain drowned out most small sounds, so for me to hear something through it meant it was close. My first thought was an animal, maybe a tapir or a capybara passing by. I held still, listening. The sound came again, slower this time. It was not the splash of hooves in water or the brush of a body through low plants. It was lighter, almost careful. My mind went to jaguars next. I'd been told they sometimes stalk camps, drawn by the smell of food. My fire had gone out hours ago. There was nothing to keep an animal away. The rustling stopped, and the only sound was the rain. I waited, counting heartbeats, not sure if I should unzip the tent to look. The darkness outside would be complete. My headlamp was buried in my pack, and even if I grabbed it, the beam would only cut through a few meters of the downpour. Then I heard it again, but closer. This time it was a faint squelch, like a foot pressing into wet soil. Not paws, feet. I froze. My breath felt louder than it should. The jungle is not empty. There are hunters, fishermen, people who live far from the cities, and sometimes, just sometimes, you come across someone who does not want to be seen. I had heard stories from locals upriver. Not all of them were about criminals. Sometimes it was just a stranger who didn't speak your language, someone who might see you as a threat or as prey. The steps were slow. They came from the direction of the trees, moving toward my tent. The rain disguised their distance, but I could tell they were within 20 or 30 feet. I reached for my machete. It was lying on the ground beside my mat, and held it in my lap. My hands were wet with sweat despite the coolness in the air. I sat there like that for a long time, just listening. Sometimes the steps stopped altogether, and I would think maybe I had imagined them. Then a shift of weight, another soft squelch, and I knew they were still there. The worst part was the not knowing. An animal would have moved on by now. Whoever or whatever was out there was lingering, and that meant they were aware of me. The rain didn't let up, but eventually, I heard the sound change. The footsteps began to circle, slow and wide. They kept a distance at first, maybe 15 meters, moving through the undergrowth with deliberate pauses. I could picture someone scanning the camp, looking for movement, for light, for any sign I was awake. My tent was dark. I sat perfectly still. My back ached from holding the same position, but I didn't move. After a while, minutes, maybe longer, the steps came closer again. I could hear water dripping from leaves onto something solid, maybe their shoulders or head. I could almost feel the weight of them watching me. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the steps receded. They didn't run, just walked slowly back into the trees, the sound blending with the rain until I could no longer tell if they were still there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, machete in hand, eyes fixed on the faint outline of the tent walls. Every creak of a branch, every shift of the wind, made me think they had come back. My legs cramped from sitting upright, but I didn't lie down. When the first gray light came through the fabric, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The rain had eased to a drizzle. The ground was churned with fresh footprints, bare human feet. They circled my tent, stopping at different points, and then led back into the trees. I followed them a short distance until they vanished into the undergrowth. That was enough for me. I packed quickly, shoving wet gear into my bag, not caring about order or weight. My canoe was tied to a tree at the riverbank, half filled with rainwater. I bailed it out with my pot, pushed off, and let the current take me downstream. I didn't look back. Even hours later, when the rain finally stopped and the sun began to burn through the mist, I kept glancing at the tree line. The jungle was just as it had been, green, endless, and loud with life. But I knew someone had been there, close enough to reach out and touch my tent, and they hadn't made a sound until they wanted me to hear them. It was the summer of 2014, and my friend Ryan and I decided to take a short camping trip to a quiet spot we'd found the year before. It was in the hills just outside of Boise, Idaho, about an hour's drive from the nearest store, and far enough from any main road that you couldn't hear cars at night. We had been there once before, and we liked how secluded it was. The only sounds were the wind moving through the pine trees and the occasional call of some bird you couldn't see. We planned to stay for 2 nights. We both brought our own tents, food, and enough gear to keep us comfortable. The place wasn't an official campground. It was just a clearing in the trees we had found on a hike months earlier. We parked the car at a dirt pull-off, then carried our gear in about half a mile. There was no trail, but the way was easy enough to remember from last time. By the time we got there, the sun was already lowering behind the tree line. We set up camp quickly, tents facing opposite sides of the clearing, with a small fire pit in the middle. The air was warm, the kind of dry heat that stays in the ground even after the sun sets. The forest felt calm, but it was the kind of calm where you were always aware of how far you were from other people. That first night was uneventful. We ate, watched the fire burn down, and eventually went to our tents. I remember lying there listening to the distant rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. In the middle of the night, I woke up once, not from a sound, but from how quiet it was. Sometimes silence feels louder than noise. I fell back asleep after a while. The next day we hiked around the area, explored a few ridges, and collected more firewood for the night. By evening, we were back at camp. That night, the temperature dropped quickly. We sat close to the fire, talking less than the night before, just watching the flames. I noticed Ryan kept glancing into the tree line. I thought it was just nerves, but I felt it too. Something was different. I couldn't hear any of the small forest noises that usually never stop. No crickets, no birds, not even the wind. We stayed up later than planned, maybe because neither of us felt like lying in the dark just yet. Eventually, though, the fire burned low and we went to our tents. I had trouble falling asleep. My body was tired from hiking, but my mind kept tuning in to every little sound outside. The fabric of the tent rustled when I shifted, and that seemed loud enough to give away my position. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and tried to slow my breathing. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up again when I heard footsteps. They weren't rushing or clumsy. They were slow, deliberate, the kind of steps where whoever's making them doesn't want to be noticed. My first thought was that it was Ryan, maybe going to take a leak, but the steps were too far from his tent. They were on my side of the clearing, moving just outside the reach of the moonlight. I stayed perfectly still, barely even breathing. The steps stopped for a while, then started again, this time moving toward the fire pit. There was no fire left, only cold ash, but I heard the faint scrape of a boot on a rock. I wanted to call out, to ask if it was Ryan, but something about it didn't feel right. If it had been him, he would have had a light, or he would have walked directly from his tent. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my flashlight, but that would mean making noise and showing exactly where I was. Instead, I just lay there, gripping the handle of the small knife I always kept next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps moved again, slower now, as if whoever it was looking around carefully. Then they stopped completely. For what felt like forever, I heard nothing. I couldn't tell if the person was still standing there, or if they had left. My heart was pounding so hard that I started worrying it was loud enough to hear outside the tent. Finally, I heard movement again, but it wasn't walking. It was a faint crunch, like someone kneeling on dry leaves. This sound was right at the edge of my tent, near my feet. I froze. My mind was racing. There was nothing valuable out here, nothing to steal. Whoever it was wasn't here for things. I kept the knife in my hand and didn't move. After what must have been a full minute, I heard the steps again, moving away this time into the woods. They didn't go fast, but eventually the sound faded into nothing. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening, trying to make sense of it. I thought about unzipping the tent to check if Ryan was awake, but I didn't want to risk making any sound. By the time the first light came through the trees, my sleeping bag was damp with sweat. I got out of the tent and saw Ryan already standing there. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His face was pale and he was scanning the tree line. I didn't need to ask if he'd heard something. We packed up quickly. Neither of us talked much as we took down the tents and stuffed our gear into our packs. On the way back to the car, we both kept looking behind us, expecting to see someone. We didn't. The woods were empty again, like nothing had happened. When we got to the car, I finally saw it, fresh footprints in the dirt pull off. They weren't ours. They were larger than my boots, and there were two sets, both coming from the direction of the woods, not the trail we had taken in. They stopped right near the driver's side door of my car, then turned back toward the forest. We didn't stay to inspect them. We just got in and drove. The road was rough, but I didn't slow down until we hit the pavement. That was the last time I went camping in a place without other people around. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted, but I know for sure that they knew we were there, and they came close enough to touch our tents. That's not something you forget. I camped on a farm once, and I still don't like to think about it too much. It was late summer 2014 in southern Ohio. I was 25 back then, and I'd been trying to take more solo trips to get away from the noise, as I used to call it. A coworker of mine had mentioned an old family farm they no longer really used for crops, just for storing equipment and letting the fields go mostly wild. He said I could pitch my tent there for a weekend if I wanted. The place was about an hour outside of the nearest town. You had to take a narrow, cracked road that curved through patches of corn and soybean fields, then a long dirt lane that rattled my car until I finally saw a faded red barn and an empty farmhouse with boarded-up windows. Nobody lived there anymore. The house leaned slightly to one side, the paint flaking like sunburned skin. The barn doors hung crooked on their hinges. The fields around it were a mix of overgrown grass, weeds, and a few fenced-off sections where rusting farm tools and machinery sat half-buried in the earth. You could tell this place had been abandoned for years. I parked near the barn and grabbed my gear. It was late afternoon, still warm, but there was a strange stillness in the air. The wind barely moved the tall grass. I didn't hear birds, just the faint buzz of crickets and the occasional creak of old wood from the barn. I walked a little ways behind the barn to set up camp. There was a small clearing at the edge of a line of trees, maybe 50 yards from the main field. It gave me some shade and cover, but I could still see the barn in the distance. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered a pile of sticks for a small fire. The smell of dry grass and dirt was heavy in the air. When the sun went down, the farm turned pitch black. No streetlights, no distant glow from houses, just darkness swallowing everything. My little fire barely lit a small circle around me. I cooked a can of chili on my camp stove, ate slowly, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But there was something about the silence here that didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow, like the place was holding its breath. Around 9 p.m., I decided to walk out into the field a bit with my flashlight. The grass brushed my knees, and the beam lit up small patches ahead of me. I kept glancing back at my tent to make sure I could still see it. The barn looked different in the flashlight beam. Darker, more massive, almost leaning toward me. When I got about halfway to it, I stopped. I didn't hear the crickets anymore. I stood still, thinking maybe I just imagined the difference. But no, the sound had completely cut off. My ears felt strange, like when you walk into a soundproof room. Then I noticed it, a faint, rhythmic clinking sound. Metal on metal, slow and uneven. It was coming from inside the barn. I told myself it could just be something loose blowing in the wind. But there was no wind. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just listening. The clinking would stop for a few beats, then start again. I decided I didn't need to know what it was. I turned and walked back to my tent, trying to keep my pace calm, even though my skin felt tight and cold. I got in the tent, zipped it shut, and sat there with my flashlight off. I could still faintly hear the clinking, and the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't random. It had a strange, uneven pattern, like someone was dragging a chain and letting it drop every few steps. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the grass. They were slow, crunching through the dry stems, and they were coming from the direction of the barn. My tent was thin enough that I could hear everything clearly. The steps stopped about 10 feet from where I was lying. I didn't move. My sleeping bag suddenly felt suffocating. The sound stayed there for what felt like minutes. No footsteps, no breathing, just the weight of someone's presence. Then I heard the faint scrape of something metallic, like a shovel blade dragging lightly against the dirt. It circled my tent slowly, pausing every few steps. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. When it stopped directly behind my tent, I thought I might actually pass out. I didn't have a weapon, just a small pocket knife, and I knew if I unzipped the tent, whoever or whatever was out there would hear me. Then the sound began to move away, back toward the barn. I lay there for hours, barely breathing, until I finally saw the faint light of dawn through the fabric of my tent. When I got out in the morning, the grass around my tent was bent down in a thin trail, like someone had walked in circles around it. I followed the trail a few steps, and it led straight toward the barn. That was when I saw something I hadn't noticed yesterday. Behind the barn, there was a deep trench in the dirt, maybe 3 feet wide, running for about 20 yards. At the end of it was a large, rusted metal drum lying on its side. The top had been pried open, and the inside was pitch black. I didn't look inside. I packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing at the barn, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me. By the time I got to my car, the morning air still had that dead quiet. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my shoes on gravel. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway. I never went back, and I never asked my coworker about the farm. I don't want to know who was out there that night or what they were doing. All I know is that whoever it was, they didn't want me there. And I think if I'd stepped out of that tent, I wouldn't have made it off that farm. I had decided to take a few days off from work and spend some time outdoors. It was early autumn of 2017, and the air was starting to turn crisp. I packed up my old camping gear, The same tent I'd been using since college, a sleeping bag that had seen better days, and a small propane stove. My plan was to head out alone to a quiet camping spot in the northern woods of Montana, far from any popular trails. I'd been there once before with a group of friends years back, but this time I wanted the stillness of solitude. I parked my car at a small gravel clearing off a dirt road and hiked in with my pack. The hike was about 4 miles through tall pine trees, with dry leaves crunching under my boots. The forest was quiet except for the occasional creak of branches and the faint rustle of something small moving through the undergrowth. The deeper I went, the more the sounds of the world faded away. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing I remembered. It was a flat piece of ground near a narrow stream, with enough space for my tent and a fire pit someone had built years before. I set my pack down and got to work. The air was cool, but I was sweating from the hike, and every time the wind blew, I could feel it chill the damp skin on my neck. I pitched my tent facing the stream, making sure the entrance was downhill so rain wouldn't flood it. I collected enough wood to keep a fire going for a few hours, then cooked a small meal. The sun dipped lower, throwing long shadows across the trees, and the orange light made the whole place look like it had been painted in warm colors. Once darkness came, the forest turned into a completely different world. My fire crackled softly, and I could hear the constant trickle of the stream nearby. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, and something, maybe a rabbit, darted through the bushes. I wasn't afraid. I'd camped alone before, and the noises of the night had always been part of the experience. Around 9 p.m., the fire had burned down to glowing coals. I sat on a small folding stool, sipping hot tea from my metal cup. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, just a quick snapping of twigs somewhere in the dark behind me. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps were heavier than that. They weren't constant either. A few steps, then silence. Then another step closer. I turned my head slowly, but beyond the edge of the firelight, the forest was nothing but blackness. The sound stopped. I could hear my own breathing, louder than I wanted it to be. I waited, eyes fixed on the darkness, but nothing moved. Trying to shake it off, I tossed another small log onto the fire, and the flames brightened the clearing again. I didn't see anything unusual. After a few minutes, I climbed into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay inside my sleeping bag with a flashlight in hand. The sound of the stream helped me relax a little, but my ears kept picking up small noises. Tiny snaps, faint crunches. Around midnight, I woke to the feeling that something was outside my tent. I didn't hear it at first. I felt it, a sort of pressure in the air, like I wasn't alone. Then came a long, slow dragging sound in the dirt just outside. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked. The dragging stopped. I turned off my flashlight and listened. It was dead quiet for a full minute. Then there was a single, sharp crack of a stick breaking. I gripped my small camping knife in one hand. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Every time I woke, I would listen for movement, and sometimes I thought I heard it, slow, deliberate steps somewhere just out of sight. By early morning, the sun hadn't quite risen yet, but the sky was pale gray. I stepped out of my tent, my breath fogging in the cold air. The ground around my campsite told a story I didn't want to think about. There were footprints in the dirt, human ones, big enough that they definitely weren't mine. They circled the tent, went down toward the stream, then came back again. The strangest thing was how quiet it had been. Whoever it was had moved slowly, carefully, like they didn't want to wake me. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving my sleeping bag into my pack without even rolling it. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the tent poles down. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching. When I finally hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, I noticed something else. A large, flat rock near the fire pit had been turned over. Underneath it was a small pile of cigarette butts, all old and weathered. That meant someone had camped here before, maybe more than once, maybe recently. The hike back to my car felt much longer than the hike in. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but it was always nothing. My heart didn't stop pounding until I saw the glint of my car through the trees. When I reached the gravel clearing, my stomach dropped. There was a fresh footprint in the dirt by my driver's door, and it wasn't mine. I unlocked the car fast, tossed my gear in the back, and started the engine without even taking off my pack. I drove the rough dirt road until I hit pavement, and only then did I pull over. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down. I kept replaying the night in my head, the footsteps, the dragging sound, the footprints in the morning. None of it made sense. Why circle my tent? Why stay quiet? Whoever it was had the chance to speak up, to make their presence known, but they didn't. They just watched. That was the last time I went camping alone. Even now, years later, when I hear a stick snap in the woods, I feel that same icy weight in my chest. I never found out who it was, and I guess I never will. But I know one thing. Someone was out there with me that night, and they weren't lost and they weren't passing through. They were there for me.